Hello, how are you guys doing? My name is Chris A. Matthews, and you were listening to the Marriage Underdogs Radio Show podcast. And once again, I have another phenomenal guest. And yes, you're right, it is a licensed marriage and family therapist. Today is actually a very special episode because I'm going to be introducing Jon Baldwin, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist associate, but also Jon is a member of the relationship counseling group team. So, Jon, just want to welcome you here. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to be present.
Definitely good to be here.
Definitely. And for full transparency, Jon works in my practice, relationship counseling group, PLLC. So with this episode, we were talking about doing something a little bit different. In this episode, we're going to make it a teaching series. We're going to educate the audience, educate the listeners on the 5 axioms of communication. Now, whenever you are working with couples, I'm sure, Jon, you can relate to this as well. What's the number one thing that everyone's calling and saying they need help with?
Communication.
Communication. So I felt that it would be very helpful for us to focus a whole episode on the 5 axioms of communication. Now, these 5 axioms were not developed by myself, they were actually developed by Paul Watzlewicz. And that name I murdered just now, as you can tell for the pause. So let's go ahead and see if we can just do speech and hear that name out loud.
Paul Watzlawick.
Paul Watzlewicz. Okay, we got that covered. Now, we can get to work. So let's start with axiom 1. You want to do the honors, Jon? Axiom 1.
Yeah, axiom one is that intimate partners cannot not communicate.
Yes, we cannot not communicate. And Jon, I want you to start by giving an example of what that means to not communicate. Because I know we're using a double in there, right? Not communicate.
Right. There's always a message being sent, essentially. Even when you don't say anything verbally, well, it's being communicated non-verbally, or messages are being assumed. So there's not an option to say nothing and it stay there. There's going to be a message sent. The question is whether or not it's the message that you want sent.
Exactly. And what we find with couples, as the listeners know, I'm married, been with my wife going on 18 years. Jon, you also engaged as well. How long you and your partner been together?
Almost 3 years now.
Okay. So you and her have been together 3 years. And do you have an example of when this axiom has played in your own relationship?
Actually, there was an interaction. We worked in the same building at one point, and we looked at each other, and someone saw us look at each other. At the time, they didn't know that we were in a relationship, but based solely on our glance, we didn't even communicate anything. Just by the way that we looked at each other, the person was like, "Oh, y'all have something going on. Y'all are connected in some way." And so they ended up asking us questions about our relationship. So even though we didn't use any words, there was a loud message communicated that we were connected.
So it's a feel. And with that example, Jon, we tend to forget that communication is not just verbal, it's nonverbal as well. When you are communicating verbally, tone plays such a big role because you can have a lot of examples. You ask your partner, "Hey, baby, you good?" "I'm fine." "Hey, baby, you good?" "Yeah, I'm good. I'm fine." "Hey, baby, you good?" I'm fine. Right? I've said I'm fine 3 different ways, but based on tune, based on how it comes out, you can tell there's a message behind the message. And we want to get out of mind reading, right? So a lot of times when you ask your partner what's wrong and they say nothing, or they're not engaging, or they're quiet, it could be a couple things. It could be, "I'm not interested in talking." "I'm upset." But the one I really hate is the one where your partner says nothing or says they're fine, but it's more so of the, you know why I'm mad, and you should know why I'm mad, right? So we had a guest, and she said something that stands out. She said, we don't need to be shoulding all over ourselves.
Mm.
So let's don't be shoulding over yourself, right? And that looks like preventing your partner from having to read your mind. Let's jump into axiom number 2.
Intimate partners communicate using content and relationship. This means that they're not just using the situation and what's happening, they're also using the way that they see themselves, the way that they believe you see them, and the way that they see the relationship to translate their experience and to communicate with each other.
And I want to pull that out an example. In my book, Finding Your Relationship Fix, the 4 Reasons Couples Seek Counseling, I give a great example about a young lady, a woman who was in a new relationship, but she had been cheated on multiple times in prior relationships. So now she's with a new boyfriend, and the boyfriend has scattered work hours. But he usually will have a routine of calling his girlfriend when he gets off work. This particular evening, she doesn't get the call at 10 p.m. So the way that we want to look at content in relationship-based communication, for starters, how I see myself. She did not see herself as attractive. How I see you. She saw her boyfriend as someone that was attractive and very flirtatious. How I see you seeing me. She then saw her boyfriend seeing her as someone that was naive or would be bamboozled by his actions. So when that call comes in later than 10 p.m., she starts the conversation with an attitude. She says, I bet you think I'm stupid, don't you? And the boyfriend's taken aback. Baby, what are you talking about? And she says, well, why did you not call me? It's 10:45. What were you doing the last 45 minutes? And to make matters worse, he works around a lot of attractive women. One day she went to bring him some dinner at work, and she saw the coworkers that are there. And she continued to see herself as unattractive. So when you look at how she saw herself, and then you look at how she sees her boyfriend seeing her, and then you look at how she also sees him, you put that together, and it was a concoction for just a huge mess. John, what do you want to say on that axiom?
Yeah, I think that that example explains how sometimes you may get a call or get a response that doesn't make a sense initially. But when you start to think about, I wonder how my partner's seeing themselves right now. What ideas do they have about me? What ideas do they have about the relationship right now? You start to understand, okay, there's some other pieces. Maybe they've got something that they need to process and individually, or there might be something that's going on that we need to get clarity on before moving forward because there's something's being not being communicated clearly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things we learned through counseling is that certain partners might need more validation than others. So in this relationship example I shared earlier, the male partner began to provide a lot more affirmations. But the female partner did her work too. She went to individual counseling and looked at why she did not see herself as someone that was attractive. She was actually adopted into a home where her skin tone was darker than her siblings. And she didn't look like her mother and father, hence being adopted. So she would get picked on and teased by other members in the family because she was darker skinned. That happened at an early age. So ingrained in her psyche was that I'm not pretty because I'm darker. So when she got the work done in individual counseling, she began to see herself now as attractive. You add that with the boyfriend validating and acknowledging her beauty as well, that helped. So we burn the candle at both ends, the individual work and the couple work. Let's jump to axiom 3.
Intimate partners establish communication sequences based off of stimuli and responses. This essentially means that they're responding to something that's occurring in the environment. So there's the stimuli, the situation, the incident, content, and then there's the response. And sometimes that can mean them looking to the other person for cues, and instead of acting based off of their own perspective, they're looking for the other one for the initiative.
Yeah, and I like that you said looking for the other one because this axiom highlights that at the end of the day, you have to be able to understand there's only one thing that you control: your own actions. You only control your actions. You do not control your partner's actions. Now, you get to control your response to your partner's actions, which essentially are still what? Your actions. If you're making actions based on the assumption of how your partner is going to respond, you're doing too much, right? Make the action or produce what you're going to do, and then seek to then respond after your partner acts. And I want to give a great example of this. I was working with a couple, and it was a young man. He was 28. He was doing well. Everything was set up in his life. He'd been dating his girlfriend for 2 years. They were actually living together, and they were cohabitating. And she wanted to get married, and they were intimate. They were having sex, premarital sex, but they weren't having a lot of premarital sex. So in therapy, the female partner was asked, hey, why is that an issue? What's going on? And she said, well, I feel guilty having sex with my partner because I'm not married, and I don't like that. I don't have the security to really just let myself go without marriage. Let me give a side note. I meet individually with both partners before collectively coming together to do a safety check and also understand deeply what they are experiencing. And I do that without the other partner there, not to keep secrets. But I find that when both partners can share openly without having to tiptoe over their words, the clinician can get a lot of good recon and not have to feel pressured by the other person in the room. I don't have to manage two people's emotions at one time. I can just manage the client just talking to me. So then when I introduce myself to the male partner, I'm interviewing him. He says, "Man, I'm gonna be honest with you, bro." I was like, "What's going on, man? Talk to me." He said, "Look, if we was having more sex or if she initiated more sex, I would have put a ring on it a long time ago. I just can't see myself marrying somebody who doesn't initiate sex like that." So that's an example of the stimuli and the response. In this particular relationship, the male partner was banking marriage on her initiating more sex, and she was banking having more sex on him initiating marriage. Talk to me, John. What's your take on this one?
Yeah, it also makes me think about that idea of how sometimes people struggle to accept something when they feel like the person's just doing it to please them, or like instead of they're doing it because they want to do it. It kind of that comes to mind about how when you're doing something because it's who you are, it's what you believe in, it's based off of your values, your priorities, there's a deeper meaning, there's a deeper significance, and there's more staying power versus when you're acting just based off of the response.
Absolutely. Because in the example, she was only engaging in premarital sex because she thought that if she had saved herself a marriage or didn't have sex at all, he wouldn't have remained interested, which might have been the case. But she wasn't presenting her authentic self. So the discomfort of having premarital sex was a conviction or an indicator that she was being pressured to act within a way that she normally wouldn't be acting. Sounds like that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, yeah, and they were kind of stuck in that place where neither one of them were able to really show up authentically. Maybe he did want to marry her, but he wasn't able to do that because she wasn't comfortable being sexually active. And so those were created like a brick where they did both want to be together and they both wanted to be engaging with one another, but that
The value
because
system,
yeah, those different values
different
weren't
values.
explicitly communicated, so they weren't on the same page. There was the disconnect.
And that's the piece that I want you to talk about. When the values are not communicated, we then begin to show up in a relationship not as our authentic self. And that's what a lot of marriages are getting built on. They're getting built on representatives and not the actual people.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the bigger challenge that people run into. Or sometimes people will talk about, oh, they changed, and it wasn't that they changed, it was that you met their representative. You didn't take the time to get to know who they really were. You didn't pay attention to their patterns over time. And after a while, people, again, once they get more comfortable, you get a better idea of what their actual habits are, what their actual lifestyles are, versus them showing up in the interview as their best version of
Absolutely.
themselves.
And John, that requires more than just spending time with somebody.
Mm.
We have intentional time, and then we have just you have the quality of time, and then you have the quantity of time. So quality time is intentionally asking certain questions. Quality time looks like creating unique situations by way of different environments to better understand how your partner is going to respond. And if this partner, an example we're talking about, was convicted by not waiting to have sex when she was married, then what happens moving forward, you ask, when else is she going to then have those same type of silences where she's not expressing herself? Could it be later on in a relationship when there's children involved? She's now initially saying, okay, I'm suppressing who I really am to meet his needs, but that's not going to work. There may be a guy out there, or there are guys out there that have been fine waiting to have sex until marriage, because that one value may lead to another value, may lead to another value. And then on his behalf, there are a lot of women out there that don't want to wait to have sex until marriage either. So you can find someone that fits the value system that you have as well, but you got to communicate that.
Definitely. And as you were saying, when it's just you and that person, it might be easy sometimes to ignore those things or to let it slide, or maybe it'll be fine down the line. But when children start to get involved, when families start to get involved, those differences in values become more pronounced and you can't ignore them anymore. And so it's a lot better to do that work up front and be on the same page, make sure you're sharing those values so that when those bigger decisions come along or those challenges come in, you can navigate those as a team and you're not fighting over fundamental differences when you don't really have, um, I guess, a choice to choose differently. You're already in it.
And as therapists, we don't pick your value system,
Yeah.
right? Like we don't pick your value system for you. I'm a Christian. I know you are as well too, John. So if couples come in and they're having premarital sex, it's not the therapist's job to judge if you're having premarital sex and you proclaim to be a Christian. That's not our job. Our job isn't to do that. And I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there because I know we might have those within the faith listening to us talk about premarital sex.
Yeah. And it's important to make sure that one thing that we can do is help people realize their values. Sometimes they're not honest with themselves about their values. And so it could take some reflecting on or highlighting some of those incongruencies. It's like, okay, where do you stand on this? What are your beliefs? And highlighting, oh, maybe that's why you're feeling a discomfort because you're acting in ways that are incongruent. So let's figure out what congruency looks like, where we can bring you into alignment so that you're going to function more effectively. Because you lose a lot of energy when you're doing things that don't align with your values.
I love that, man. That was you hit it spot on. We may not help you determine what you see as value or not, but we help you align those values, and then we help you dive deeper into understanding where your perceived values come from, because a lot of it is originated to family of origin as well. So let's jump into Axiom 4. What's Axiom 4?
So intimate partners communicate digitally and analogically. And this means that there's the words, there's the content, there's the message that's being sent, but then there's also the nonverbal. So it's not just what's being said, it's how it's being said, it's the tone, it's the volume, it's the body language. So there's both of those pieces going on. So when someone says, like you were saying, you're fine in a bunch of different ways, a lot of times when they're asking that question, it's because they're noticing something going on. And one way to overcome that challenge is highlighting what you're seeing. So I'm noticing this nonverbal communication. I've noticed that you haven't been as talkative today. Therefore, I'm wondering if there's something going on. Can you express yourself?
And a lot of times in relationships, we find that it's harder to step out of the way when we think of the space we share with our spouse. So, what do I mean by that? When your partner's having an issue, and I've done this, I'm sure you may have as well, John. How many times has your woman had an issue and you ask her, hey, what's going on, baby? You could tell based on a face expression, a change in or pattern of behavior, and she'll go, no, everything's good. But you know something's wrong.
Mhm.
We ask couples to go the extra mile. Instead of just saying, no, everything's fine, bring your thought to the forefront. I had this happen to myself. I was asking my wife the other day, I said, hey, babe, everything good? She says, yeah, everything's good. And we were on the way to dinner. We were driving. And I asked her, I said, no, hey, babe, I'm noticing that you're checking your phone often, more than usual. I'm noticing that your leg is shaking. I'm noticing that you tend to be a little bit more frantic or concerned. Talk to me. Now, what did I just do? I listed nonverbal cues and I asked her to speak to those, right? Why are you checking your phone? Why is your hand moving a little bit? Why are you a little bit more frantic than usual? And then she simply just said, I was just wondering if we cut the alarm off before we left the house. So when you find your partner asking you what's wrong, or hey, what's going on, or hey, can I help you with something? They're not just making that out of thin air. You must have exhibited something physically that led them to sense that something might be off.
Yeah, a lot of times when you're in a relationship, you develop that connection with your partner. Um, when you do care about someone deeply, when you do are trying to build a future with someone, then their well-being is linked to your well-being. If something's going on with them, something's going on with you. So you start to be more sensitive to those little cues. And sometimes they might see something or notice something that you're experiencing that you haven't even noticed. And you may not know that you're a little off, and it might take some reflection to be able to articulate what's different. But recognizing that your partner may have some insight and they're not just they're asking a question because they're noticing something. They're connected to you. They care about you. And so it's worth doing the work to help them better understand you so that they know how to navigate moving forward and how you can support each other well.
And John, I like what you said about when you're in a relationship, especially over time as it grows, you develop a sensory that connects with your partner. And we hear often in therapy, a lot of partners will say, well, I didn't want to bother you with that. I didn't want to concern you with how I was feeling. You already are concerning me because I'm connected, and you're never a bother because I've chosen to sign up to share my life with you. So we have to dive deeper into family of origin. Where's that coming from? Prior relationship history. Why do you believe that when you bring to my attention how you're feeling, that I'm going to be bothered? Well, the last boy you dated or the last woman you dated said that you complain too much or you were a nagger. So you're now taking that into the new relationship when your current partner doesn't believe you're nagging or complaining. They genuinely just want to be connected with you and be on one accord.
Yeah, and a lot of times people don't realize the harm that it does when you don't communicate that you're struggling, or you wait to communicate after it's gotten overwhelming. So instead of letting your partner in early, you try to deal with it on your own. And then after all this time has passed, you've been struggling with this for so long, they've been trying to support you and you've been trying to deal with it on your own. Like it creates a bigger challenge than it would have if you would have just brought them in sooner, whether it was to give you reassurance or give you support. So there's so much value in bringing in your partner early so that you can tackle the challenge together. They might be able to bring resources or strength or support, so that you can handle the issues more effectively.
And John, that's actually great business advice as well. I recall being at a conference and Magic Johnson was speaking. And Magic Johnson, he shared this tidbit. It's some of the best advice I've ever heard when you look at leadership or managing a team of people. He said that he tells all his staff to bring little problems to him before they become big problems.
Mm.
So bring little communications to your partner before you need them to be big communications. Let's jump to the last one, John. Axiom 5.
Intimate partners engage in communication roles that are symmetrical or complementary, which are both influenced by power and control. And that essentially means that either their communication is symmetrical, which means it's equal, balanced, the same type of communication, or it's complementary in that the different roles support one another. And the power and control piece comes in where symmetrical communication, usually you've got a balanced dynamic. And with that power and control of the complementary communication, you want to be mindful of, are these roles being engaged in voluntarily or are they being engaged in by force? A good example is the traditional gender roles or household perspective. Sometimes that is what people want for their relationship and it works well for them and they both signed up for that, where one person's directing, the other person's following, and if that's what they're both trying to do, it works well. However, when that's being forced or it's being engaged in involuntarily, that's where you run into challenges.
Absolutely, because when you are not given a voice to express your authentic self and show up in the relationship the way that best suits you when it comes to communicating, then at that point, we go back to what we said earlier. You're just being a representative of yourself. And I know that as relationships change, the roles change.
Mm.
When my wife and I initiated our marriage 15 years ago, we've been together 18, married 15. I recall instinctively taking a leadership role. Well, there were certain dynamics that led to that. For starters, my wife moved to Charlotte, so she's moving to a new city, a city I'd lived in my whole life. She was starting a new profession. I'd been in my job a little bit longer. So I took the leadership role not because she was meek or weak or wasn't capable. I was just in a better position at that time. But then when we had additional children, I had to take more of a follower role because she had more experience managing and navigating the household. Although we were both working, I was receiving to-do list or task from her
Mhm.
because she was teaching and training me on how to shed the selfishness that I initially had to build a business, to grow in
Mhm.
my profession. So there were moments where the power and control actually dictated if we were symmetrical or complementary for that season within the marriage.
And I think that it's really important to be adaptable and to recognize like different areas of strength. You can be strong in one area and not strong in this area, or like you might find that skill levels changed and one person might learn something faster than another. So being willing to play to your strengths again allows your relationship to be stronger for sure. Um, I also think when you do both have strong styles or you're symmetrical, knowing how to communicate effectively and making sure that still you have those shared values becomes even more important. You want to make sure that you're fighting for the same goal. That way you're not both fighting and then it becomes an ego battle and you're ending up stuck.
Absolutely. And we can't begin to talk about the importance of power within a relationship. And sometimes we hear the word power and we automatically think of abuse. I'm not talking
Mhm.
about the power and control, right? I'm not talking about abuse.
Mhm.
You have different types of power, right? So legitimate power comes by way of what you would call a title. My wife has legitimate power as my wife because that's a title, that's a position of authority she's in when it comes to being a partner within the relationship. Reward power. My wife and I both utilize reward power as a form of validation and appreciation because we like positive affirmations. Expert power. You talked about that earlier, John. You might be more knowledgeable in a certain subject or area, or just have a better understanding of a particular skill that the relationship needs that both partners can benefit from. That doesn't make you better or worse. It just means that when you look at the whole goal of a relationship, isn't it to acquire more together than you can independently?
Exactly.
Referent power. I love this power. The referent power looks like being able to influence your person based on your value system. My wife's referent power skyrocketed when I began to see her run every morning 4 miles. Every morning, doesn't miss a morning. Rain, sleet, snow. We live in a little town community outside in the suburbs of Charlotte, and we'll hear all the times when we go to church or the sports leagues that my kids play in. A parent will make a point to say, "Hey, man, I saw your wife running this morning," or church members, "Wow, it was raining. Your wife was out there running," and that power to be able to show that dedication for running every day is something that influences me to try to do a little bit better, my health, right? And then the last power, which is abusive, the power we don't want you to initiate when it comes to symmetrical and complementary communication, is called coercive power, right? Coercive power is the fear, that power that people use to get something done to intimidate another person. But those other types of power are what we're talking about, and they align well with complementary and supplementary communication styles and how couples interact.
I think that a lot of times when people do revert to coercive power is when there's fear or when there's sometimes stress or pressure. And recognizing that when you do decide to lean on that coercive power and when you're starting to get results based off of fear or because of stress or because you're feeling out of control, um, you may be getting compliance in the moment, but you're losing like that referent power. You're losing the ability to influence based off of your character. You're losing the strength of the relationship. So for those immediate results, it's costing you the quality of your relationship. It's costing you the closeness. It's costing you the that ability to be safe and vulnerable with one another. So being mindful that the type of power that you decide to wield is going to impact the quality of your relationship.
Absolutely. And we got to do a follow up on just we got to do a follow up just on the powers types because it prompted me to mention power because symmetrical and complementary communication, and it's very normal or common for us to hear couples use a honey to-do list,
Mhm.
right? And when you look at it, it can be ignored that power is involved in that, right?
Mm.
Because one person is submitting to the list. The other person is obliging to complete the list, right? So at the end of the day, it is still both submission in the sense that I want my partner to be happy, right? Jon, what are some just kind of final thoughts? We went through the 5 axioms of communication, and just as a review, axiom 1, couples cannot not communicate. Axiom 2, intimate partners communicate using content and relationship. Axiom 3, intimate partners establish communication sequences based on stimuli and responses. Axiom 4, intimate partners communicate digitally and analogically. And Axiom 5, intimate partners engage in communication roles that are symmetrical or complementary, which are both influenced by power and control. What are your takes on the final thoughts? Or what
Yeah,
final
my Yeah, my final thoughts would essentially be again highlighting the importance of intentional communication. Whenever you approach your partner, whenever you are being approached by your partner, be mindful of the explicit messages you're sending, the words that you're using, but also the nonverbals. Take that into consideration because it makes a big difference on whether or not your partner feels heard, makes a big difference on whether or not they're going to be able to hear what you're communicating. So when you're approaching, make sure you're approaching in a manner that's going to be well received. So minimizing the hostility or aggression, taking the time to calm yourself before you approach your partner, taking the time to make sure you're in a good space to listen. It's like, hey, maybe now is not the best time to talk about this. Give me a second. Let me do this first so that I can give you my undivided attention. So being mindful of those types of things can make a big difference in the quality and health of your relationship.
100% agree on everything you just mentioned, Jon. I'm glad that you highlighted making sure that people slow down to create an environment where they can be the best listener possible. We've come to an end to this episode. Jon, I'm definitely going to have you back because I want to do some more educational series like this for the podcast for our listeners. You guys have been tuning into the Marriage Underdogs radio show. Once again, I'm your host, Chris A. Matthews, and we had Jon Baldwin on as well, who's also licensed marriage and family therapist. And I just want to let you guys know that every Tuesday at 10 a.m., we air new episodes on Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Until next time, I hope that you guys are doing well, and we look forward to you tuning in on Tuesdays at 10 a.m.